The dust cloud appeared on the horizon just as Sarah Mitchell finished hanging the last of her laundry. She squinted against the amber light of the setting sun, watching as a lone rider emerged from the shimmering heat. Her hand instinctively moved to the rifle propped against the porch railing. 3 years of living alone on the Colorado frontier had taught her caution. 3 years since they'd buried Thomas beneath the cottonwood tree on the eastern ridge. The rider came closer, and Sarah could make out details now. He sat tall in the saddle, wearing a black hat pulled low over his face. A long duster coat hung from his shoulders despite the summer heat. Something about the way he moved spoke of violence barely contained, like a wolf padding through tall grass. Her fingers tightened on the rifle as he approached her property line. He stopped at the fence, raising one hand slowly in greeting. Even from this distance, Sarah could feel his eyes on her, studying, measuring. She stepped forward to the edge of her porch, raising the rifle to her shoulder in one smooth motion. Thomas had taught her well before the fever took him. She never missed what she aimed at. The stranger dismounted with fluid grace, his spurs jingling softly in the evening quiet. He kept his hands visible, palms open. Smart man. Dangerous men often were. As he came closer, Sarah's breath caught despite herself. A jagged scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, stark white against sun-bronzed skin. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, holding secrets and sorrow she couldn't begin to guess. "Evening," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "Name's Cole Brennan. My horse threw a shoe about 5 miles back. Wondering if you might have a barn where I could tend to him, maybe some water I could purchase." Sarah kept the rifle steady. She'd heard that name before, whispered in town with a mixture of fear and fascination. Cole Brennan. The man who'd killed 7 soldiers in Arizona. The outlaw who'd burned down half of Silver Creek. The gunfighter no lawman dared to face alone. And now he stood in her yard, hat in hand, asking for water like any ordinary traveler. "I know what you're thinking," he continued, taking another careful step forward. "You've heard the stories. Most of them are true, I won't lie to you. But I'm not here to cause trouble. Just need help with my horse, then I'll be on my way come morning." "The stories say you're a killer," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the hammer of her heart. "They say you leave death wherever you go." Something flickered across his scarred face. Pain, perhaps, or regret. "I've done things I'm not proud of. But I've never hurt a woman, and I've never taken what wasn't offered freely. You have my word on that, for whatever a man like Ms. Word is worth." The horse whinnied softly, favoring its right foreleg. Sarah had always had a weakness for suffering creatures, and the animal clearly needed care. She lowered the rifle slightly, though she kept it ready. "Barn's around back. There's a pump by the door. You can water your horse and fix that shoe. But you sleep in the barn, Mr. Brennan. You don't come near this house." "Yes? I'm grateful. And Mr. Brennan?" She raised the rifle again, just enough to make her point clear. "If you try to come inside, if you take one step toward my door, I will shoot you dead where you stand. I don't miss. Do we understand each other?" He met her eyes directly, and she saw something there that surprised her. Not anger or threat, but respect. Maybe even relief. "We understand each other perfectly, Mrs. Mitchell. You won't have any trouble from me." He led his limping horse toward the barn, and Sarah watched him go. She told herself the flutter in her chest was fear, nothing more. Certainly not curiosity about the man behind those storm-cloud eyes, or wondering what had carved those lines of sorrow into his face. She'd buried one dangerous man already. She had no intention of letting another into her life, no matter how her treacherous heart might whisper otherwise. As darkness settled over the ranch, Sarah bolted her door and tried not to think about the stranger sleeping in her barn. But sleep came slowly, and when it did, her dreams were filled with gray eyes and unspoken questions that morning would bring too soon. Sarah woke to the smell of coffee and fresh biscuits, which was impossible because she was alone in her house. She sat bolt upright in bed, reaching for the pistol on her nightstand. The sun was barely cresting the mountains, painting her bedroom in shades of pink and gold. Through her window, she could see smoke rising from her outdoor fire pit. She dressed quickly, fury building with each button she fastened. The man had direct orders to stay away from the house, yet here he was, bold as brass, making himself at home on her property. She grabbed her rifle and stormed outside, ready to run him off her land or put a bullet in him, whichever proved necessary. Cole Brennan stood by the fire pit, a cast-iron skillet in one hand. He'd removed his duster, and she could see the well-worn handles of twin revolvers at his hips. His shirt was clean but faded, stretched across broad shoulders. He looked up as she approached, and had the good sense to step back from the fire, raising his free hand. Before you shoot, I want you to know I never came within 10 feet of your house. I saw you had chickens, noticed they'd laid some eggs. Figured breakfast was the least I could offer for your hospitality. Coffee's already done, and these biscuits should be ready in a few minutes. Sarah stopped, momentarily thrown off balance. In 3 years of widowhood, no one had cooked for her. The women in town treated her with pity, the men with either unwanted advances or uncomfortable distance. She'd become a ghost in her own life, neither wife nor maiden, just a shadow tending an empty house. I told you not to come near my house, she said, but the steel had left her voice. And I haven't. Been up since before dawn. Fixed your barn door that was hanging crooked. Noticed your water trough had a crack, so I patched it with some pine tar from my stove bag. Your fence line has 2 posts that need replacing before winter, and your chicken coop could use reinforcement against foxes. I can handle all that today if you'll allow it, then I'll be gone by tomorrow morning. Why would you do all that? He poured coffee into a tin cup, setting it on a stump near her but not approaching. Because you showed me kindness when you could have shot me on sight. Because I've spent 10 years taking from this world, and I'm trying to learn how to give something back. And because. He paused, seeming to struggle with his words. Because you remind me of someone I failed a long time ago. Sarah's grip on the rifle loosened. She moved closer, picking up the coffee cup. It was strong and bitter, exactly how she liked it. Who did you fail? Cole turned back to the biscuits, using the moment to compose himself. My sister, Emma. She was married to a man in Silver Creek, a banker named Raymond Marsh. On the surface, he seemed respectable. Pillar of the community. But behind closed doors, he was a monster. He hurt her. Bad. And when she finally got the courage to leave him, he killed her. Made it look like an accident. The pain in his voice was raw, unguarded. Sarah found herself sitting on the stump, coffee forgotten in her hands. The fire in Silver Creek. The stories say you burned half the town. I burned Raymond Marsh's bank with him locked inside it. The fire spread from there. I didn't mean for others to lose their homes, their businesses. But I won't pretend I'm sorry Marsh burned. The law wouldn't touch him because he had money and connections. So I became the law that night. He served up the biscuits onto 2 plates, bringing one to her before retreating to the opposite side of the fire. The 7 soldiers in Arizona? They were deserters who'd attacked a Navajo village. Killed women and children. The army was covering it up, so I made sure they faced justice. You're a vigilante, Sarah said quietly. I'm a killer who tells himself he has good reasons. His gray eyes met hers across the flames. I don't expect you to understand or forgive. But I won't lie to you about who I am. You deserve honesty at least. They ate in silence as the sun climbed higher. Sarah studied him, this dangerous man who'd invaded her carefully controlled solitude. She thought about Thomas, about the year before he died when the drink had gotten bad, when his hands had gotten rough. She'd never told anyone about that year, about the bruises she'd hidden beneath long sleeves, about the fear she'd felt in her own home. When the fever took him, part of her had been relieved, then guilty about the relief. My husband wasn't a good man, she heard herself say. The word surprised her, emerging from some deep place she'd kept locked. Not at the end. Everyone in town thinks I'm the grieving widow, but the truth is more complicated. Some days I miss him desperately. Other days I'm grateful he's gone. Does that make me a terrible person? It makes you human, Cole said gently. Love isn't simple. Neither is grief. Is that why you're running? Because you're carrying too much weight. He smiled sadly. I'm running because there's a federal marshal named Jack Crawford who won't stop until he sees me hang. He's 3 days behind me, maybe less. I shouldn't have stopped here at all, but my horse needed help, and I guess I'm tired of running alone. He stood, brushing crumbs from his pants. I'll get started on those repairs now. Best I make myself useful while I can. Sarah watched him walk toward the barn, his words echoing in her mind. 3 days. That's all the time they had before his past caught up to him. She should tell him to leave now, to take his horse and his dangerous history and ride away from her quiet, lonely life. But she didn't. Instead, she sat by the dying fire and wondered when she'd become the kind of woman who wanted a killer to stay. 2 days passed in a strange, suspended reality. Cole worked from dawn until dusk, repairing everything on Sarah's property that had fallen into disrepair. He replaced fence posts, reinforced the chicken coop, and rehung the barn door so it swung smooth and true. He worked with quiet efficiency, speaking little but always aware of where Sarah was, giving her space while somehow making her feel protected rather than threatened. Sarah found herself watching him when she thought he wouldn't notice. She brought him water and cold lunch meat at midday, and they'd sit in companionable silence under the cottonwood tree where Thomas was buried. Cole never asked about the grave, and she appreciated his discretion. In the evenings, after he'd retreated to the barn, she'd lie awake listening to the sounds of him moving around, settling his horse, and she'd feel less alone than she had in years. On the third morning, everything changed. Sarah was collecting eggs when she heard the thunder of hooves. Multiple riders, coming fast. She dropped the basket and ran for the house, but Cole was already there, appearing at her side like a ghost. "Get inside," he said urgently. "Lock the door. No matter what happens, don't come out." "Please don't come inside," she found herself saying, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "If you come inside, if you try to hide here, they'll burn my house like they burned that bank. I know they will." His eyes held hers for a long moment. "I would never bring that down on you. I promise. Now go." She ran to the house, but instead of hiding in her bedroom as he'd probably intended, she grabbed her rifle and positioned herself at the window. 6 men rode into her yard, led by a lean man with silver threading through his dark hair. He wore a marshal's star on his vest and carried himself with absolute authority. Jack Crawford. Even from a distance, Sarah could see the determination in his face. Cole stood in the open, hands away from his guns. The marshal and his men formed a semicircle around him, cutting off any escape. Crawford dismounted slowly, his hand resting on his revolver. "Cole Brennan," the marshal called out. "You're under arrest for murder, arson, and assault on federal soldiers. You can come peaceful, or you can die right here. Your choice." "I'll come peaceful, Marshal, on one condition." Mrs. Mitchell had no idea who I was. She showed charity to a stranger, nothing more. "You leave her out of this." Crawford's eyes flicked to the house, and Sarah felt his gaze like a physical weight. "That true, You didn't know who he was?" Sarah pushed open the window, keeping her rifle visible. "He told me his name was Cole. That's all. He fixed my barn door and asked for nothing in return. Whatever he did before he came here, it has nothing to do with me." "Mrs. Mitchell," Crawford said, his voice gentler now. "This man is dangerous. He's killed at least 12 men. He's left a trail of destruction across 3 territories. I understand you may have felt threatened, that maybe he forced you to help him." "He didn't force me to do anything," Sarah said sharply. "And I won't stand here and watch you call me a liar or a fool. He worked for his keep, and has been nothing but respectful. Now you want to arrest him, that's between you and him. But don't you dare suggest I don't know my own mind." Something flickered in Crawford's expression. Respect, perhaps, or surprise. He turned back to Cole. "The lady speaks well of you. That's rare. Most people you've crossed paths with have different stories to tell." "Most people I've crossed paths with deserved what they got," Cole said quietly. "But the marshal's right, Mrs. Mitchell. I am dangerous. I've done terrible things. Some of them were justice, some were just revenge dressed up to look like justice. I'm not a good man. But I'm trying to be better than I was." "Trying doesn't bring back the dead," Crawford said. He pulled iron shackles from his stole bag. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." Cole complied without resistance. As Crawford locked the shackles, he spoke loud enough for Sarah to hear. "There's a trial waiting for you in Denver. Given the circumstances of some of your victims, you might find sympathy from certain quarters. But that's for a judge and jury to decide, not me." They lifted Cole onto his horse, binding his feet to the stirrups. He looked toward the house one last time, and Sarah felt something tear inside her chest. She'd known him for only 3 days, yet somehow his leaving felt like losing something precious she'd just discovered. "Marshal Crawford," she called out, surprising herself. The words came from some deep place of certainty. "When you get to Denver, when this goes to trial, you tell them Sarah Mitchell will testify on his behalf. You tell them he's capable of more than violence. You tell them he's capable of kindness." Crawford studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll tell them. For what it's worth, I hope you're right about him." The marshal and his men rode out, taking Cole with them. Sarah stood on her porch, watching until they disappeared beyond the horizon. The ranch felt emptier than it had before he'd arrived, as if he'd filled spaces she hadn't known were hollow. She looked at the repaired barn, the straight fence posts, the reinforced chicken coop. Evidence of his presence, Proof that he'd been real and not just some fever dream born of loneliness. That night, she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about his gray eyes, the sorrow carved into his scarred face, the careful way he'd moved around her property as if afraid his very presence might contaminate her. She thought about Thomas, about the difference between a man who spoke gentle words but wielded hard fists, and a man who'd done terrible things but treated her with unwavering respect. As dawn broke on her fourth morning alone again, Sarah made a decision. She'd spent 3 years hiding from life, tending a grave and an empty house. Maybe it was time to step back into the world, even if it meant stepping into danger. She had a testimony to give in Denver, and a dangerous man whose heart she'd glimpsed beneath the scars and the violence. Whether anything could come of it, she didn't know. But she'd learned something these past 3 days. Sometimes the most dangerous choice was the one that made you feel alive again. Sarah closed up her house 3 days later, leaving the chickens with her neighbor and loading her wagon with supplies for the journey. The women in town gathered around her with concern and confusion, unable to understand why the quiet widow was suddenly venturing to Denver to testify for an outlaw. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, was particularly vocal. "Sarah, this is madness. That man is a killer. You barely knew him for 3 days, and now you're risking your reputation to speak on his behalf? What would Thomas think?" Sarah secured the last of her supplies and climbed onto the wagon seat. "Thomas is dead, Martha. And the man I'm going to speak for showed me more respect in 3 days than some supposedly decent men have shown me in 3 years. Now if you'll excuse me, I have a long journey ahead." The 2-week trip to Denver gave Sarah plenty of time to question her decision. She camped alone under vast skies, feeling small and vulnerable in the wilderness. Twice she encountered other travelers who eyed her with curiosity or concern, a woman alone on the frontier. Once, a group of rough-looking men approached her camp, but she sat calmly with her rifle across her lap, and they moved on without incident. Thomas had taught her to shoot, but Cole had reminded her she was strong enough to defend herself. Denver was overwhelming after years in a small frontier town. Buildings rose 3 and 4 stories high, the streets churned with wagons and carriages, and people rushed everywhere with urgent purpose. Sarah found a modest boarding house and cleaned up from the journey, then made her way to the federal courthouse. The clerk at the desk looked at her with barely concealed skepticism when she explained why she'd come. The trial for Cole Brennan doesn't start for another week. And I have to tell you, the prosecution has 17 witnesses lined up. Your testimony, while noted, is unlikely to change the outcome." "I didn't come all this way to change the outcome," Sarah said firmly. "I came because a man showed me kindness, and I believe in telling the truth about what I witnessed. When does he need me?" The clerk consulted his papers. "The defense is scheduled for the 2nd week of testimony. I'll make sure they know you're here." Sarah found Cole's lawyer 3 days later, a young man named Daniel Webster who looked barely old enough to shave. He met her in a cramped office above a haberdashery, his desk buried under legal documents and law books. "Mrs. Mitchell, I appreciate you coming forward, but I need you to understand the situation. Cole Brennan has refused to defend himself. He admits to every killing, every fire, every act of violence he's charged with. He says he deserves whatever punishment the court decides. He won't even let me present mitigating circumstances." "Then he's a fool," Sarah said bluntly. "And you're his lawyer, which means your job is to defend him whether he wants it or not. So here's what you're going to do, Mr. Webster. You're going to get me on that witness stand, and I'm going to tell those 12 men about the Cole Brennan I met. Then you're going to find the families of the people he actually helped, because I guarantee you they exist. The Navajo village he protected. Other women like his sister who he saved from violent men. You find them, and you make that jury see his more than just the blood on his hands." Webster stared at her, something kindling in his young face. Hope, perhaps, or determination. "He won't thank you for this. He's convinced he deserves to hang." "Maybe he does," Sarah said quietly. "But maybe he also deserves someone fighting for him, someone who believes he could be better than his worst moments. Don't we all deserve that?" The next day, Webster arranged for Sarah to visit Cole in jail. The deputy led her through iron doors into a dim corridor lined with cells. Cole sat on a narrow cot in the last cell, his head in his hands. He looked up when he heard footsteps, and shock registered across his scarred face when he saw her. "Sarah. What are you doing here?" "I came to testify," she said, gripping the bars between them. "I came to tell them the truth about who you are." He stood quickly, crossing to the bars. Up close, she could see he'd lost weight, and shadows darkened his gray eyes. "You shouldn't have come. You should be home, safe, living your life. This isn't your fight. Maybe I'm tired of being safe. Maybe I'm tired of living half a life in an empty house. You came to my ranch broken and running, and you showed me kindness. Now I'm returning it. Kindness. His laugh was bitter. Sarah, I'm going to hang. The evidence against me is overwhelming because I did every single thing they're accusing me of. Your testimony won't change that. Then I'll testify anyway. I'll tell them you fixed my barn and reinforced my chicken coop. I'll tell them you made me coffee and asked for nothing in return. I'll tell them you protected me from your own danger by refusing to hide in my house. I'll tell them you're more than the worst things you've done. Why? The word came out broken, desperate. Why does it matter to you? Sarah reached through the bars, her hand finding his. Because in 3 days, you made me feel alive again. Because you looked at me and saw a person, not a widow to pity or a woman to pursue. Because I think you're tired of being the villain in your own story, and someone needs to show you there's another way forward. Even if that way leads through a courtroom and possibly a gallows. Cole's fingers tightened around hers. I don't deserve your faith. Probably not. But I'm giving it anyway. They stood like that, hands intertwined through iron bars, until the deputy came to tell her visiting time was over. As she walked away, Cole called after her. Sarah? Thank you. For seeing something worth saving in me. She turned back, meeting his eyes. I saw it because it's there, Cole. The question is whether you're brave enough to fight for it. The trial lasted 3 brutal weeks. The prosecution painted Cole Brennan as a monster, parading witness after witness who spoke of violence and destruction. They showed evidence of burned buildings, dead men, and terrified communities. Marshal Crawford testified about the chase across 3 territories, describing Cole as cunning and dangerous. The evidence was damning, overwhelming, impossible to refute. Through it all, Cole sat silent, his face expressionless. He wouldn't defend himself, wouldn't explain his actions. Sarah watched from the gallery, her frustration mounting. It was like he'd already decided his own guilt and was simply waiting for the world to confirm it. Then came the defense's turn, and Daniel Webster proved he was more capable than his youth suggested. He called Sarah first. She walked to the witness stand with her head high, aware of every eye in the courtroom on her. The prosecutor, a silver-haired man named Jameson, smiled at her condescendingly. Mrs. Mitchell, you knew the defendant for how long? 3 days. 3 days. And in those 3 days, did he tell you about the 7 soldiers he killed? He did. Surprise flickered across Jameson's face. He confessed to murder? He told me those soldiers had deserted the army and attacked a Navajo village. That they'd killed women and children. That the army was covering it up. He told me he made sure they faced justice when no one else would. Justice? That's called vigilante killing, and it's against the law. Sarah leaned forward. Mr. Jameson, if your daughter was murdered and the law did nothing because her killer had money and connections, wouldn't you want someone to stand up for her? If soldiers butchered innocent children and faced no consequences, wouldn't you want someone to make them answer for it? We call it justice when it's convenient, when it follows proper channels. But Cole Brennan's sister burned to death at her husband's hands, and the law called it an accident. What would you call that? The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Morrison banged his gavel, but Sarah saw the jury listening intently. Webster followed with other witnesses. A Navajo woman who testified that Cole had saved her village, bringing food and medicine after the soldiers' attack. A shopkeeper from Silver Creek who admitted Raymond Marsh had been a violent man who'd terrorized his wife. A former sheriff who confirmed that Marsh had influential friends who'd protected him from prosecution. Then Webster did something unexpected. He called Marshal Crawford back to the stand. Marshal, you've hunted Cole Brennan for 2 years. In all that time, has he ever hurt an innocent person? Crawford was silent for a long moment. Not that I'm aware of. Has he ever stolen from anyone who didn't steal first? No. Has he ever harmed a woman or child? No. But that doesn't excuse. I'm not asking you to excuse anything, Marshal. I'm asking you to tell the truth. In your professional opinion, is Cole Brennan a man who kills for pleasure, or a man who kills for what he believes is justice? Crawford looked at Cole, then at the jury. Justice, I suppose. Misguided, illegal justice, but justice nonetheless. The closing argument stretched for hours. Jameson painted Cole as a dangerous man who'd taken the law into his own hands, who couldn't be allowed to walk free lest others follow his example. Webster argued that Cole had acted when the system failed, that he'd protected the vulnerable when no one else would, and that a man who could show such kindness to a stranger deserved a chance at redemption. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Sarah barely ate or slept, pacing her boarding house room and wondering if her testimony had helped or simply prolonged Cole's agony. On the morning of the 3rd day, word came that the jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed. Sarah found her seat in the gallery, her hands clenched in her lap. Cole was brought in wearing shackles, and for the first time, she saw fear in his gray eyes. Not fear of death, she realized, but fear of hope. He'd lived so long as the villain that the possibility of anything else terrified him. Judge Morrison called for order. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreman, a weathered rancher with kind eyes, stood. We have, Your Honor. On the charge of murder in the 1st degree, how do you find the defendant? Guilty, Your Honor. Sarah's heart sank. Guilty meant hanging. She watched Cole's shoulders slump, watched him close his eyes as if accepting his fate. However, the foreman continued, and the courtroom went silent. The jury wishes to make a recommendation. We find that the defendant acted with sincere belief that he was serving justice when the law failed. We find that he protected vulnerable people when no one else would. We find that he showed mercy and kindness even while being hunted. Therefore, we recommend the court show leniency. We recommend 20 years imprisonment with possibility of parole after 10, rather than execution. The courtroom erupted. Judge Morrison banged his gavel repeatedly. Order. I will have order. When the noise died down, Morrison looked at Cole. Mr. Brennan, you've been found guilty of serious crimes. However, this jury has seen fit to recommend mercy, and I'm inclined to agree. You'll serve 20 years at the territorial prison. Use that time to become the man these people seem to believe you can be. If I ever see you in my courtroom again, there will be no mercy. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor, Cole said, his voice rough with emotion. They led him away, but not before he turned to look at Sarah. Their eyes met across the crowded courtroom, and she saw gratitude there, and something else. Hope, perhaps. Or promise. Sarah returned to her ranch 3 weeks later. The house felt different now, less like a tomb and more like a home. She tended her animals, worked her land, and lived her life. But once a month, she made the journey to the territorial prison. The visits were brief, separated by thick glass and supervised by guards. But they talked, sharing pieces of their lives. Cole told her about the books he was reading, the skills he was learning. She told him about the ranch, about the town gossip, about the slow passage of seasons. Their friendship deepened through those fragmented conversations, building something solid from whispered words and patient hope. 5 years passed. Then 7. On the 9th year, Sarah received a letter written in Cole's careful script. The parole board had reviewed his case. His behavior had been exemplary, and several of the people he'd helped had written letters on his behalf. They were recommending early release after 10 years instead of 20. Sarah stood on her porch as the sun set, holding that letter. 10 years. 1 more year, and Cole Brennan would be free. She thought about the dangerous man who'd arrived at her ranch seeking only water for his horse. She thought about the person he'd become through patience and determination. She thought about herself, about how she transformed from a frightened widow into a woman who'd traveled alone to Denver and faced down a courtroom. The future was uncertain. Cole might walk free and disappear into the territories, seeking a new life far from his past. Or he might come back to this ranch, to the woman who'd never stopped believing in him. Sarah didn't know which would happen. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would be here, waiting, when he made his choice. And whatever he decided, she would finally be living fully, no longer hiding behind locked doors and warnings to keep danger outside. Sometimes, she'd learned, the most dangerous thing was safety itself. Sometimes you had to let the cowboy inside, scars and all, and trust that love could redeem even the darkest past. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Sarah folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her pocket, then walked toward the cottonwood tree where Thomas was buried. She stood there in the gathering darkness, finally ready to say a proper goodbye to the past and hello to whatever future awaited. 1 more year. Just 1 more year until she found out if the dangerous cowboy who desperately wanted her heart had truly found redemption, or if some stories were meant to end with longing rather than fulfillment. Either way, Sarah Mitchell was ready. She'd learned to be patient. She'd learned to be brave. And most importantly, she'd learned that sometimes the greatest love stories began with a warning, please don't come inside. Because real love respected boundaries, earned trust slowly, and proved itself through actions rather than words. The stars emerged one by one overhead, eternal and patient. Sarah smiled up at them and walked back to her house, no longer alone even in solitude, knowing that some distances were meant to be crossed slowly, and some hearts were worth waiting for.